So let's make a start. Yeah, I mean, technically, we are still missing an author. But hey, let's not let that worry us. If anyone spots Neil joining us, give us a shout. It's like Panto, isn't it? Nadia is here. And I'm so delighted to have Nadia here from the Right to Roam movement. We've spoken to lots of folk from Right to Roam over the past couple of years. We started with Nick, the author of the book of Trespass, one of the planners of the Right to Roam movement. Towards the end of last year, we had Amy Jane Beer, another member of the Right to Roam movement, and today we've got Nadia, who's the land rights expert in Right to Roam. Nadia is a naturalist and conservationist and land justice activist. She worked in land policy for the RSPB and has worked for over a decade in urban areas delivering environmental education and community engagement. She's a trustee for the Wildlife and Countryside Link and works with the BPOC conservation, addressing issues of decolonising the sector, because rights are for everyone, aren't they? So let me just bring her in. Hello, Nadia. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks. This is unexpected. Oh well, let's roll with it.
We'll roll with it. It's fine. Yeah. Well, I mean, what we started talking before we kicked off about what an amazing couple of weeks it's been. Did you have any idea of how big this would become when you were waiting for the decision to come through from the courts?
No, I don't think we did at all, really. I've been part of the campaign for just over a year, and it's been running for just over 2 years. And we laugh and joke at how long it's going to take to win the right to roam or to get into the mainstream. Like Nick always says, as soon as we're on the one show, that's it, we've won the right to roam. And Amy was on BBC Breakfast, of course, not quite the one show, but getting closer. I don't think at all. We knew that Dartmoor was worth our focus. We started, obviously Guy Shrubsole lives down in Devon and so is closely linked to the Trespass group and the activist groups down there. So we kept an eye on it and had been putting energy and resource into amplifying the cause and what was going on. Frustratingly, not getting support of BMC or Ramblers. No one else seemed to want to stick up for supporting wild camping. So we were don't know, is this niche? We know it's important in terms of right to roam and telling the story of enclosures, but no, not to the point of Labour shifting to saying that they're going to support a right to roam act or they're moving in that direction. So no, we're a bit worn out, but in a good way.
But I mean, I think that's the amazing thing, and weirdly, if the decision had gone the other way, you probably wouldn't have garnered half as much support. Isn't that just the strange way that things work? Is that you get a decision which is so obviously unfair, and everyone can see that it just tramples over established rights, that it's just infuriated people, hasn't it? And it's really become a lightning rod for the frustration, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, weirdly now we've got a pantomime villain, haven't we? When we talk about enclosures, actually I live in Scotland now because I can have the right to roam. It's great. And I was giving a talk the other night to some people where I live in the local village hall. A Scottish guy put his hand up and he went, well, there are enclosures in Scotland and in England. And I was like, yeah, they just happened a really long time ago and it feels like history. But actually enclosures have never stopped. If you imagine once we were free, we could sleep, take from the land, live on the land, and slowly over centuries that's been chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. Dartmoor was just an anomaly of the law left. It was kind of stranded legislative wise. So those rights we've always had were assumed, and we did have them because they weren't specifically said you can't camp. And it's a bit like when an animal goes extinct. It makes everybody go, oh my God, what the hell's happening to our environment? It's very much one of those kind of iconic species disappearing that's made people go, oh God, things are really bad. And what we need to be careful of now is it's not about how do we bring that species back from the brink. we need to ask ourselves what's fundamentally rotten about the system that means there was only one place left to wild camp. And I think because Devon was that anomaly, and because therefore it attracted that kind of like outdoorsy type people who made expeditions of it, there were lots of stories that people just came out and told in their hundreds.
But I mean, that's the, you know, it's easy to forget that this land has been partitioned up, isn't it? I mean, it's because it happened so long ago that we've forgotten that actually most of the land used to be common land, and now it's been completely reverted. So I am going to steal a little of Neil's thunder. I'm sure he's going to join us. Don't know, we'll see. But I mean, so there's a reason that this book is called The Circle in the Sky. And it comes from a poem that's written by John Clare, who's someone who's featured in lots of our books. Lots of our authors have plucked the famous English pastoral poet John Clare out. And so Neil has done the same here. So he talks about a poem that was written by John Clare in the early 1800s, in which he grieves achingly for the loss of the commons in his childhood and their thriving natural life. So this is where we are. We're in the early 1800s. Enclosures are happening around him, and John Clare is writing about how he feels about it. And so his poem goes, or a bit of it goes: unbounded freedom ruled the wandering scene, nor fence of ownership crept in between. To hide the prospect of the following eye, its only bondage was the circling sky. And I just, it just shows that such a long history that we've had from this land being taken away from us, and then people actually waking up to what that means. And obviously these things have happened before. You know, we've had things like the Kinder mass trespass, but it really feels like this has come at a particular time, and a really important time, when, particularly through lockdown, we all realised just how important it was to spend our time in the natural world, and the benefit that we got from it. And now we've got this issue that all of a sudden has become totemic, and it kind of, it's brought everyone out, hasn't it? It's brought it to the fore, and everyone's gone, wow. We don't have as much right to roam and to camp as we thought we did have, and these last tiny vestiges of it are being taken away from us, and that's massively frustrating, isn't it? I mean, that's the yeah, massively. And I think it's also one of those times where like all of these pieces have seemed to come together, like with COVID happening, and then the cost of living crisis. And like, I think lots of, I guess I've worked in the conservation sector, so I'm acutely aware of biodiversity decline, alongside climate change and the climate impacts that are happening. But biodiversity decline's really a big part of what's happening in the UK at the moment, and it sits closely alongside. So I've been aware. I guess my journey coming into the Right to Roam campaign was through thinking about, like, you know, we've got some of the most well-supported conservation organizations in the world, yet we've got some of the worst wildlife, that like numbers that declining. And I was like, something's not quite right here. We keep creating more nature reserves and protecting more nature legally, but it keeps going down and down and down. So I went down that rabbit hole, and then I started to recognize, actually, it's like, it's because of landowners getting to do what they want on land, essentially means, you know, while wildlife's declining. And then you've got stories, there's huge, like, I think but maybe I'm in my bubble, so I need people to check myself, but like increasing stories about river pollution and the, you know, the quality of water for wild swimming, and all of these different little stories are part of the same story as like the inequity of, like, we are just like helpless at the end of the day when you have such concentrated land ownership. It means that when you have lockdown, people don't have the freedom to walk in green spaces, and well, when lockdown was over, a lot of landowners were like, right, okay, you've had your fun now, this is not a path anymore. And I think just all of these stories have come out to this moment in time where I think people are ready for it. And it's often with the biggest movements in history, you've never really, we think now when we look back at history that at the time people could name what was happening, but you can't, can you? It's only as historians on reflection we go, oh, that was, you know, that was a women's rights movement, or that was, they didn't think it was a women's rights movement at the time in terms of the individual
women protesting and fighting for different rights. We can look at it now, and I wonder what this movement is that's happening, but there's certainly been like heaps more people coming into this space and starting to ask questions about land and belonging, and something's rotten in our culture, and trying to put a name to it. And I think the Right to Roam movement has just kind of filled a gap in terms of its brutal honesty of land ownership and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, so it really feels like the pendulum is starting to swing back. So I mean, we've talked about it lots on this, and so everything that we're trying to do through Adventurous Inc. is reconnecting people with themselves and nature, and these are connections that were entrenched deep inside of us on a physical level, but we've actually lost it on a social level. So we've as a society, we don't understand where we are anymore. We don't, and so, you know, we'll be talking tonight about belonging and how nature helps with that. But it really does feel that in 30, 40, 50, 100 years time, we'll look back at this time right at the start of the 21st century and go, that was the time when everything changed. Because I think it expands out from just that lack of connection with the natural world into so many aspects. I mean, last year we read Braiding Sweetgrass, and we had a lovely conversation about it, about just the difference a connection to nature can mean, and what we need to do to nurture that. But it means so much more. It shapes everything. You know, our lack of connection to nature is resulting in lots of unhappiness and lots of unhealthiness, and that's the top and bottom of it. And I think for such a long time we've only been looking at the symptoms, and we've not really looked at the cause, whereas now we're starting to get right back to the root of it and say, actually, it's this lack of connection that we started to become aware of in lockdown in particular, and we're starting to cultivate it. So for me, it feels like what I've called the great reconnect, which is changing that narrative. And we're reconnecting, and it's not just with the natural world. I think you can see lots of things like, you know, the rebirth. There's a big folk revival happening at the moment. There's lots of people getting into singing. There's community is connection as well, and that's really coming back. So Nadia, tell us about the work that you were doing before about the nature conservation stuff, and how that led to you becoming an activist and becoming part of the movement.
Yeah, so my life has been around nature protection, seeing that nature's declining, worrying about it, and thinking about how to do that. So naturally, I went into the nature conservation sector. I worked for Wildlife Trust RSPB for many years, and I'm very much wrapped up in that world, feeling like doing the best that I could to help nature, whether that was surveying birds, managing nature reserves, working with communities and showing them wildlife and educating people. And then I moved into environmental policy, and that was very specifically looking at the legal protections. So what we have in law, which means that you can't go and destroy a nest or kill a bird. So what legal protections have we got in the UK, and how do we make sure that they are upheld by government? How do we make sure they're robust, and how do we make sure we protect them? So that's what I did. And the longer I spent in that job, the more I saw a really weird cognitive dissonance between the conservation sector and what they were doing and the reality. So we have designated nature reserves. So you might have heard of the term SSSI, Site of Special Scientific Interest, or SPA, SAC, or different designations legal. So these are areas that are protected for wildlife and for certain species. And the majority of those sites in England are in bad condition. A lot because of the encroaching landscape around it is in bad condition, so pollution runs onto it, for example, or because of climate change, and the plants that grow there and the birds or whatever that visit have shifted, and so it's no longer good for what it was designated for in the first place. So what is it now? And I was like, and I moved into this thinking of like, it feels like we're just perpetually trying to protect nature from time, from people, from change, from climate change, and in this place of stasis, and it's just not working. Yet we are defending it like tooth and nail constantly, of like, we must protect these natural landscapes and humans are the problem. And I just remember being like, I'm really uncomfortable with this kind of view of people are the problem. And when you look at the main causes of biodiversity decline, so that's the reasons why our birds, mammals, butterflies are disappearing in abundance, but also in species, the variation of species. And the reasons are because of intensive agriculture and land management, pollution and climate change. So these are things driven by the very, very few, and more often than not, that biodiversity decline in terms of that kind of like hyper industrialization of a landscape comes down to the rights of landowners and what they're able to get away with. It has done for a really, really long time. And I remember having a conversation about upland species. So some of our iconic birds of prey are hen harriers, which people might have heard of, but doing really badly in the UK, in England in particular, because they're shot, and then they're more often disappear on game reserves. So we're like, come on a minute, these birds are disappearing on game reserves. And how do we get the public to care about a big grey bird that most people haven't seen? And I remember going, well, these grouse moors are, or these areas of upland are intensely overgrazed. They're not bogs anymore, which means that when in heavy rain, you get big runoff, and that rain goes into the towns in the shadows of these hills. So it's like, I think we need to be talking to homeowners, and I think we need to be talking to people that care about flooding. And I think we need to be thinking more widely about the social justice issue of one man owning 400 acres here and all of these towns getting flooded. And then the rhetoric and the more I looked into it, and I was like, hang on, we're being told here that this is to save tradition. This is to save grouse shooting, which has only been around 150 years. That's not my tradition. And then I was like, well, what about like Gypsy and traveller tradition, which is hundreds of years, but that's not important. And why aren't we preserving that? And I started asking these questions, and I got more and more uncomfortable with how nature protection and preservation was being carried out, because equally nature protection people are landowners who want to protect land from people. And I was like, there's something uncomfortable here. So I moved more into the land justice movement, taking me to one day just ringing up Guy Shrubsole going, can we have a chat? Because I'm really uncomfortable with how we talk about land in terms of saving nature and the injustices, the more broad social injustices of land ownership. That's a very, I don't know whether that was long or short.
Oh no, it's fine.
That was maybe about 5 years.
it takes us back to causes and not symptoms, isn't it? It's not about dealing with the symptoms by trying to work at one end of the system. It's moving back up, but I'm sure that's a hard road to walk, because it's easy to be down there at the symptoms rather than the causes. Neil's joined us. Hello, Neil.
Hey.
Hello, Tim. Hello, Nadia. Thank you for filling in for me. I didn't have a Zoom link. I was sitting here by my computer waiting for a link.
I can only apologise. My emails sometimes go into spam. I send lots of lovely emails, but when you send lots of emails, sometimes the spam filter gets a bit sniffy and starts snaffling them. So apologies for that. Thank you for joining us, Neil. I've already stolen part of your thunder. So we started the conversation. Nadia's been talking about what's happening in Dartmoor, and I've taken the first bit of the book, and I've done a little reading from John Clare of his poem where you took the title of the book from. But let's go back to that, because I'm really interested in what it was that you saw in John Clare and that poem that you were like, and that really speaks to me, and that's what I'm going to build the book around. Is that how it worked?
Well, I don't think the poem came first. I think the place came first, and then as I walked around the forest, I began to think about land ownership and land use, and obviously I talk about the expulsion of the gypsies from the forest, and I saw this as a sort of continuum, which started with all the enclosure acts and the Scottish clearances, and then this happened, the expulsion of the gypsies, and now we have the crime and policing bill with the new trespass provisions, and now we have this in Dartmoor, which is shocking but not surprising. and it just seems like a continual chain of events by which the landowners take away access to the land from everyone else. So yeah, so that, and the John Clare poem, which I knew, seemed to fit very well with my understanding of how our relationship with nature and the world around us should be, not based around ownership, but based around a sense of belonging.
So obviously we featured some of your books in the past, Neil. So we featured the last wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously you also wrote Deep Country about the long time you spent living off grid in Wales. It strikes me that you've always had this search for belonging in nature.
Absolutely. I mean, and the reason In the Circling Sky was I sort of went back to the source, the place where I first fell in love with nature as quite a young child, going there regularly, wild camping there when you were still allowed to, which you were when I was a child. And I've thought if I went back, I would examine myself, my own history, my own childhood, and where I stood in relationship to the world. So yeah, so it's quite a personal book in a way, and it's more perhaps political than my other books, in that a lot of the focus is about how we access the land, how we're able to access the land or not able to access it.
And but I mean, it's just one of those complete coincidences that we happen to be featuring it at the time when everything is happening in Dartmoor. And Nadia, it strikes me that belonging is at the heart of a lot of what people were talking about in Dartmoor as well, because it's not just any old activity, it's wild camping, which is a wonderful way of immersing yourself in a place and getting to know it and feeling like you belong. And to have that taken away from us, it does feel like a removal of a way of belonging.
Absolutely, and for people who live in that area, it's been an integral part of their sense of who they are, and it's been stolen from them. I mean, part of the reason I've moved to Scotland is because of the freedom that I have here, the right to roam. I'm now living in a cabin in the area that I talk about in The Last Wilderness. It's actually a year today since I moved here.
So we've got both of you living.
I'm also in Scotland for the same reason. Nadia? I'm on the Isle of Bute.
Oh, not so far away. Not so far away. I'm in nearer to Fort William.
Lovely. Nice.
I walk every day in Ardgour and in the rough bands in Loch Harbour.
And it does make a difference, I think. There is a greater sense of belonging, and like those meaningful the reason why camping, I think, sits so deeply with people and has caused this kind of outpouring is because that's what we're supposed to be doing. Our senses are supposed to be kind of triggered and in the way that you get when you're outdoors for a long period of time. Your brain goes into we know these things. Science has told us what happens to our to just our sense of self, our sense of being in a place and not being distracted, and the calmness that it brings, but also the way that it challenges ourselves. It teaches us about ourselves, and belonging is so deeply intertwined with culture, ritual, and ceremony. These are things we would have always done. And you mentioned right at the top, Tim, about kind of music and folk is coming back. These are things that have always been inspired by the natural world. I mean, find a folk song without some nature reference. It's a miracle to do that. And I think and so they're just nature is belonging. And actually after this thing, there's a Channel 4 documentary with Grace and Perry where I may or may not be in it, talking about Englishness and belonging. I'm kind of like mixed class. My family from Newcastle's working class. My dad's from Pakistan. I'm all kind of a bit of a mix, and I've always just been a little bit of. I kind of grew up without culture in a lot of ways, And the belonging thing that I have to say, actually, I understand that I'm from the UK or I'm from England, is because I know oak trees, and it's because I know Blackbird song, and it's because I know the seasons. That's my belonging more than anything else. And I think that's why, you know, wild camping has been so enchanting and important, because you're in nature long enough for that stuff to sink in.
That's a wonderful invocation of it. Thank you, Nadia. That, you know, just because it's easy to forget how important oak trees and blackbirds are to our sense of place and belonging. One of the things that struck me, and oddly, it's come up in the chat already. So Sian has mentioned about doing her Duke of Edinburgh's on Dartmoor, and I've heard so many people talk about Duke of Edinburgh's in the context of what's happening on Dartmoor. And I mean, I did my Duke of Edinburgh. I loved it, and it's clearly been this seed that being out there has planted in people, that actually this is important, and planted it at a really young age. I'd have to mention, so do feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I know I've been waffling on. It sounds like we've got hard 9 o'clock finish. Nadia's got to get away to watch Grace and Perry. And me too, to be honest. I didn't realise that was on at 9 o'clock. I've seen the adverts. Looks fab.
I don't have a television, so it's less
of course not. But I mean, it's so that sense of belonging has been long in the gestation, hasn't it, with lots of people. And you know, it was one of the books that we featured last year about, it's called Wayfinding, and it talks about the sense that you have when you approach a place slowly, and Neil invokes it wonderfully. So there's a great phrase in the book where Neil talks about, hang on, let me get it. He talks about the best way to immerse yourself in the landscape is that the pace of a slow walk with frequent pauses. The goal isn't to walk through a landscape, but into it. And I love that. And I think, how is that the sense that you've always had, Neil, or is that something that you've come to realize over time?
I think it's something that I always had. I mean, as I describe in the book, as a child, I was always off wandering in the woods and following streams and so on. And I still do the same now. I probably walk for about 4 hours a day without a particular destination in mind. I wander every day. I worked out in the course of the past year, I'd probably walked as far as if I'd walked to Africa. And yet I don't have a car, and I chose to just spend my entire time within walking distance of my cabin. So I've probably not been more than 10 miles away from my cabin, and yet I've walked 3,000 miles this year and crisscrossed every square inch of mountainside and woodland and followed every stream. And I feel like I've got to know the place really, really intimately and feel very much a part of my immediate landscape. I think that's always been something that I've done. I've always wandered around my immediate environment within the limitations of other demands on life. I mean, until I moved up here for the past 15 years, I've been a single parent living in a council estate in the inner city. So I was really waiting for my children to leave home, which they have now, to get that freedom back, to have that time on my hands that I now have.
But I love the distinctive perspective that gives you on so much, Neil. I've always had that sense from reading your books, and it really comes through strongly. And even in writing The Circling Sky, as you were, all your journeys were done on public transport. So there's an effort to get to places, and you were even the journey there is a slow and measured journey, isn't it? That effort makes you value it more.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's too easy to jump on an aeroplane and just suddenly find yourself in a completely new landscape, spend a couple of weeks there and then leave it, and you only skate the surface, and you don't have a sense of the distance traveled, how far you've gone. I really love traveling on foot, and if I can't travel on foot, to get somewhere. I really love traveling by public transport because it gives you a real sense of the distance traveled, the gradual changes in the landscape and so on. I mean, if I come here, I come by bus from Glasgow, which is about 3 hours, and you have that long trawl past through Dumbarton and all along the shore of Loch Lomond, and then you gradually rise into the Highlands, and then the bus crosses Glencoe, and that last hour on the bus is insane. Glencoe is some of the most beautiful mountain scenery in the country, and it's just about within walking distance for me here.
Wow.
So,
Fabulous. I mean, and it's testament to how you've both shaped your lives to be close to that. I wonder if we're so that sense of walking in the natural world and finding belonging that became so important to us during lockdown. I wonder if, because I had lots of discussions with people during lockdown as to whether it was going to mark a change in people or whether they would immediately revert back to traveling as far and as fast as they could and soaking up all those experiences that they'd missed out on. What have you both got a sense of where we are in that? I guess you could call it a more the sort of slow travel, the taking your time to appreciate somewhere and genuinely be there. Now that we're a good year and a bit past lockdown, are we still readjusting, or is it settled in, and is that something that people do value more? How do you see it?
Nadia, you take a turn.
I don't know actually. Sadly I think a lot of that initial energy might have been lost from quite a few people, and that kind of draw back into we're habitual creatures, so in terms of like habits and ease, I know that like people buying camper vans during lockdown shot up massively, and there's been kind of issues with people camping in Scotland. Apparently I don't call them issues, it's just people being people, but I don't know, I think it might have stuck for some people, but I would think that initial kind of like regular people going out and discovering things for the first time, I think it will stick because nature's magic like that, and it has profound impacts on how people experience the world. I feel like I don't have a sense of it. I imagine that people have stopped being as slow as, I mean, even just whenever I go to England, I'm like, it's so fast, everything's so fast all of the time, even just over to the mainland. So my sense of time is very slow on the island, so I think I'm probably not the best person to judge from here at the moment.
I found I finished the research, the walking for the Circling Sky, I think a week before the first lockdown. My timing was very good because then I could just sit and quietly do remote edits with my editor over the course of the lockdowns. But what I found then was during the lockdowns, when I had my daughters both came home from university and stayed with me, and they both worked at the hospital through the lockdowns, and I went out and walked out of Brighton. I walked up into the Downs on a daily basis or along the coast, and I actually, even though I've lived down that part of the country for 20 years, I'd never really thought it was up to duff, if you know what I mean. I thought actually it's nothing special. I moved to Brighton from the hills of mid Wales in a very remote location, and I always thought, the South Downs, it's just a load of bumpy fields. It's there's nothing. But actually, I got to know it in a way during lockdown that made me value it much more highly. I think that happened to a lot of people. I think a lot of people during lockdown explored their own neighbourhoods in a way they'd never really had the chance to before, and it made them more aware of the natural world in their local environment. And I would like to hope that for a lot of people, some of those lessons they've learned about how important nature can be to them will stick. I'm really hoping so. And I think people do really care about access. I mean, about access to the countryside. I mean, the reaction to what's happened in Dartmoor is very, very striking. There's absolute uproar about it. Whereas it's the tip of the iceberg, really. It's the fact that was the very last place in England where you could wild camp without getting permission. But there's only 8% of England that's got access. Do you know what I mean? It's a startlingly small proportion of the countryside. Prior to the Enclosure Acts, 30% of England was common land, which everyone could use, and everyone in their neighbourhood would have access to common land to graze their animals, or to forage, or to collect firewood, and so on. And now the amount that's left is minuscule, really, and it is just one thing after the other. The enclosures, Scottish clearances, as I mentioned, the trespass provisions within the Policing Act, Crime and Policing Act, and this is, it feels like the last straw, this, and I think people are gonna fight, because it just feels like people have been having had that opportunity to get to know how important the nature and the land is to them during lockdown. I think people feel, our last chance to wild camp in England has been taken away, or wild camp legally. Of course, you can still carry on doing it anyway and take your chances.
Arrive late, leave early, leave no trace.
I think that just on that point, though, I think it's really crucial and it's important, is that it's permissive access or coming and leaving without a trace is not a substitution for rights. Because if you've been brought up in a way where you're confident enough to camp and you can take yourself out, and you always have, and you know how to do it, and you're confident being confronted by and just going, that's fine. There are so many people who haven't yet got there and have never camped and have never walked anywhere for any length of time. And I think someone mentioned in the chat earlier, growing up in Sweden, growing up in a country where they're your rights is so different to growing up in a country where or you've got the confidence to swindle the system. They're two different things, and I think that's why we need a complete reform in the legal rights to access land.
I absolutely agree with that. I think there's a cultural disadvantage to people who are who aren't from white middle-class backgrounds as well. I think people who live in the inner city may have had, it's a long way to get to the countryside. They may not feel that they'd be welcome there. The same for minority communities as well. I think it's really important that everyone feels they have a right to be out in the countryside.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll just quickly come back on that. I work with a lot of Black people and people of colour with access to the outdoors. And I was having a meeting with a woman yesterday from Newcastle. And she was explaining, actually, for a lot of non-white communities, like a lot of outdoor activities, so like hiking, camping, like the thing that you do is very much about conquering a landscape, which is quite a kind of patriarchal, kind of colonial way of doing nature. Neil, I'm like you. I can be outdoors for 12 hours and I can travel like 4 miles because I'm just like stopping, meandering. Like, I'm not a hiker. Actually, no one in the Right to Roam movement is a hiker. We're like, when people expect that we hike and walk long distances, we don't. We just like to sit under an oak tree, maybe have a fire and a chat. And actually, but this idea of being in nature without a purpose, this name loitering is often given, like, what do you, if you're just sat in a field, it's kind of like, but if you've got hiking boots and you're walking, it makes sense. But when people linger, it's called loitering. And for Black friends that I've got, they're like, I don't really want to go hiking, but I like being in nature, but I don't feel comfortable just sat doing nothing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Neil.
I sort of have skin in the game. My daughters are Black. And so it's something that I've had to instill in them, that they can be out and they can camp. They love going out camping. They've done wild camping with me on many occasions, bothying in Scotland and so on. And I've always brought them up to feel that they're as entitled to do that as anyone else. On the other hand, you shouldn't only care about an issue because it affects you personally or your family. You should care about an issue because it's the right thing, and it's absolutely the right thing that everyone should feel equally entitled to be out and about in the countryside. Yeah, and it's not just about me and my rights. It's about everybody having equal rights.
And I think that's such a powerful statement, because this is a movement and a change that needs to benefit everyone, and actually the people it can benefit most probably aren't privileged white middle class people. There's so many more people can benefit from the health and well-being that you can get from being out in nature. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating that idea about that there is very little tradition of being in nature without doing anything. And I wondered about both of you having that strong nature conservation ecologist sort of background that has sort of gives you a reason, doesn't it, to be out there and to take your time and immerse yourself in a place that probably helps you know that place better. But I guess I'd thought about it in that context. I guess I'd not thought about it in the context of giving you a good reason to do nothing out there. What a fascinating thing.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, I spend most of my time bimbling about in the temperate rainforests, trying to spot new lichens. I can spend an hour looking at a single tree, to be honest, because they can have 20 or 30 different species of lichen growing on them. So yeah, it's certainly not. There's nothing competitive about it. Interestingly, where I'm living now is probably the outdoor capital of Britain. There is a whole industry here around people going out on kayaking courses or mountaineering, or there's several long distance footpaths like the West Highland Way or the Great Glen Way, long distance footpaths that people plan. They make huge plans to go 20 miles a day until they've done it, with hostels in between and stops here and stops there. It's the opposite of what I do. I'm not out to challenge myself. I'm just out to wander, really. It's all about wandering. It's all about going places that aren't on trails, finding new little places of my own discoveries. And it was much the same in the Circle Sky in the New Forest. I wasn't going to the celebrated spots that everyone went to. I was going off piste, as it were. Like here, I'm only 10 miles away from Ben Nevis, and thousands of people climb up Ben Nevis every year. And I have to say, people from all over the world and from all different cultures, because it's so well known. It's the highest point in Britain. But it's like a motorway. The path to the top was. The other day, I went with a couple of friends for a winter climb on a mountain in Argower. There's no path. It's almost never climbed. It took 8 hours. It took from before dawn until after dark to do this mountain. And it's absolutely untouched and wild. And I don't know how many people climb it in a year. Probably less than one a day, certainly. I mean, climbers do go there, but very, very few. And it's so spectacular. It's absolutely unbelievable spot. And yet, if I'd gone to Ben Nevis now, even in winter, there would be hundreds of people going up the mountain today, because people do what they're familiar with, in a way what's expected of them. I just feel it's so much better to find your own little spots that aren't celebrated, that aren't famous, that have meaning to you individually, rather than a broader meaning that's accepted by other people. I mean, I met people not long ago who'd they travelled up from Birmingham. There were a group of 4 Asian men from Birmingham. They came up They stayed for 2 nights in a hostel, and in the day in between they climbed Ben Nevis, and that was their goal. And it was, you know, it was a good goal for them, but that was all they did when they were here. That was all they considered. That's all they knew of this area, was that there was the highest mountain and you could climb it.
I think we're sort of back to Nadia's point about culture and how that impacts on us, and so much of the outdoor culture has been about triumph and about conquest, hasn't it? And it's certainly something that we've always tried to steer clear of in Adventurous Inc. I think one of the first books we featured was Nan Shepherd, and that completely different way of approaching the natural world. I guess what we're trying to do is divert people off the well-trodden paths in the literal and the metaphorical sense. But it comes back to culture, doesn't it? And what is the culture of the movement? And it does feel like there's a real resurgence that you can see in things like Right to Roam, of a different way of appreciating the natural world that isn't about how high or how far or how fast. It's more how much does it mean? But I don't want to put words into your mouth, Nadia. How does the movement feel to you? What are people looking for from it?
I think it is that's what you've said. And actually, yeah, people are coming to the movement because they are feeling uncomfortable with, I think there's a discomfort with what's happening, and I think people are looking for something deeper. I think we've been through this era. It's obviously not over. I went to Kendal Mountain Festival for the first time last year, and that opened my eyes. And just in terms of like this outdoor like commodification and consumption of activities, and I get that it's life-changing for people, but I think in terms of people are leaning towards the movement in search of that belonging sense of, this is my culture, and I belong in this landscape, in a gentler and a softer way. And actually, in terms of where the campaign's going next, over the next year, we are developing, well, not developing, that's a horrible corporate word, isn't it? We are writing about wild service. We think we are a culture that needs a hell of a lot of education and healing. We've been through an awful lot of pain in terms of being cut from culture, community and land, and wild service is our kind of like grading sweetgrass response. Like, I think we can learn a hell of a lot from Indigenous cultures, but I also think that given enough people inland, like time inland together, people will develop ceremony and ritual and connection themselves and intuitively learn about birds, about clean water, about the trees. We can relearn it ourselves, and we should. And we're writing wild service to give people the opportunity of that relearning and say, look, this is yours. We can reconnect again. Because one of the biggest kickbacks we get from the Right to Roam movement in terms of like, this is ridiculous, you can never have the right to roam, are the minority few with power who are basically saying the public haven't got a clue how to be in the countryside. They litter, they don't know what they're doing, like they leave fires, but all of these things which are basically people are bad, nature is good, even though we are nature, right? We've evolved alongside it this whole time. And we kind of like, we accept we're going to have to if you keep people away from nature for like 500 years, there's going to have to be a bit of re-education. And I think people are like, they're thirsty for it. People want to know, how do I exist safely? And I think there is like a bit more of a resurgence in the like survival kind of off-grid, kind of a little bit more like, how do we leave no trace, particularly as well the issues around plastic over the last 4 or 5 years. I think this idea of wanting to leave no trace and not want to be that is pretty big. So I think, yeah, I think there is a thirst for it for people for so many different reasons, whether it's mental health, whether it's to feel like they can persist and exist in the landscape without causing damage. All of these things around music, folklore, culture, just wanting to reconnect. It's there in, I thought Right to Roam was quite niche when I joined, and it's been overwhelming. You know, tens of thousands of people kind of ready for something slower and kinder. And and something that loves people again instead of hates people. I mean, I work for Nature Conservation Organisation. There wasn't a meeting I didn't sit in where it didn't talk about how horrible visitors were to nature reserves, or how annoying people were, or how do we stop visitors going there, or oh God, we've had another visitor do this. It's just like the hatred of people, you know, it's big, and it's so frustrating because it's people saying those things. People are saying anyway, but yeah.
Well, interestingly, I talk in the Circling Square about the New Forest and how it's such a unique habitat and how incredibly valuable it is for all sorts of wildlife, which has been nearly lost from everywhere else. And that is in the light of 1,000 years of continuous use as a working commons. And that shows that land can be valuable and used by people and still be of great value for nature as well. It's not either or. It's not either. It's not people live in cities and then the nature reserves should be wildernesses that no one goes to. It's really not the case. And actually, human interaction with the landscape can actually benefit nature if it's done right. So this attitude of keeping people away from nature is a very negative one. There may be certain circumstances in which you'll want to regulate that access. So in the New Forest, for instance, during the breeding season for rare waders, they closed some of the campsites, some of the parking sites, the car parking sites around the forest that are in the proximity of rare birds nesting, rare waders, which are in serious decline, and encourage people to go to other parts of the forest at that time, especially if they've got dogs with them. So there is a certain balance between access and the needs of nature, but under a lot of circumstances, access can actually be beneficial. In the same way, in woodland, light grazing can be more beneficial than no grazing or heavy grazing. It's about getting that balance right.
I think interestingly, Neil, you've got the perfect example of this actually in the book. So I mean, one of the things that was really interesting for me, again, talking about rights and access to land, is the section where you talk about the Gypsies and the way that they were forced into the enclosures. I mean, in not quite this day and age, but in modern times, people being forced into enclosures, it's not got a good history. But
no,
it's
good.
But they've been dispersed, haven't they? They've been dispersed throughout the woodland. Very little impact. I love that. Is that where the phrase "up sticks" came from? Where they
yeah, up sticks is they in the New Forest, because they lived within a fairly self-contained area of a couple of 100 square miles. They didn't use wagons. They used bender tents. So you would get some hazel poles and throw a canvas over it. And then the next day you would literally up sticks, you would pull your sticks up and move on. And they'd lived, the Gypsies lived in the forest for nearly 500 years and actually had pretty good working relationship with the local population until the Forestry Commission, I think, took ownership at the beginning of the last century. And in 1925, there were seven sites were set up within the forest, and Gypsies were forced to move onto a specific site that they were registered to and could only live on that particular site. And that persisted for a long time, nearly 40 years. A whole, more than one generation of people grew up in those gypsy encampments, enclosures. They were forced enclosures. And then it was decided in the late 50s, early 60s that they were unsuitable. That these ghettos that they'd been forced into were unsuitable for human accommodation, and they were all basically evicted from the forest, and they were dispersed to the neighbouring cities, so Bournemouth, Southampton, Portsmouth, where I grew up. My mother was from a gypsy family. Her father left the forest as a child, at the time of the beginning of the compounds. But yeah, it did create this strange sense while I was in the forest that it was a place that I felt I belonged, but at the same time it was a place where I knew that my ancestors had been forcibly expelled from at the same time. And then I began to think about things, saying, did I feel a sense of connection in the forest because I spent so many happy times there as a kid visiting? Or is there a possibility of feeling an ancestral connection to a piece of land? Because that could, in a way, be problematic. The moment you say you can feel an ancestral connection with a piece of land, are you then saying that people who don't have that ancestral connection can't feel a sense of belonging there? So I try and discuss all these issues in the book about what it means to feel a sense of belonging in the countryside or in a particular place in the countryside. So all these issues come up in the book. So, but some of you will have read it already, but I expect some people haven't quite got there yet.
But it is, I mean, it really takes us back to the heart of it, and we're back to culture again, aren't we? And we're back to that cultural connection, which was severed and then led to places that were unsuitable for human habitation. But that wasn't their choice. Their choice was to disperse themselves right across the area, leave very little impact, and live in harmony. But when that culture was taken away from them, when they were forced into one place, then that did seem like it was a problem all of a sudden. And I really feel that there's a parable there for how we're being treated in terms of our rights to the land. We've got 4 minutes left. If anyone's got any last questions that they want to get in, throw them in the chat. Please do, because I mean it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I've loved this, and I think the bit we've barely touched on is the rights that exist to the commoners in the New Forest, and that is a different legislative framework that does seem to leave some power and some opportunity for the community to be in harmony with the natural world. But even you were saying, Neil, that even that is declining over time.
I think there is an issue with it. I mean, back in the days when William Cobbett did his rural rides around the whole of Britain, and he said that the New Forest was the poorest place in the English countryside because the land was not very suitable for agriculture, and so it was very impoverished. Whereas now most houses in the New Forest area sell for £1 million, or a little semi will sell for £500,000. I mean, very few of us could afford to live there now. And the commoners' rights are attached to the properties. So you end up with very wealthy people acquiring these commoners' rights. And so you have this problem again where land ownership becomes the be all and end all, and access or use of the land is a product of wealth, whereas before the commoners really were commoners in the New Forest. They were the peasantry who were completely, because the land was not suitable for traditional agriculture, they were reliant on grazing their cattle and their horses and their pigs out in the open forest, getting firewood from the forest and so on, and gathering wild food. And that was a process that had gone on for 1,000 years. And now, because of land values, that situation has had to change somewhat. But for the time being, it is still so well regulated by the culture that's persisted within the forest that there is still very good management of the commoners' rights in terms of the welfare of the animals that are put out, the numbers that are put out in different areas and so on, that achieves this balance of maintaining this area which has got, for instance, the densest concentration of truly ancient trees in the whole of Europe, in the whole of Western Europe at least. and types of lowland heath and lowland mires that are incredibly valuable for wildlife and which have been lost nearly everywhere where the land has been enclosed, taken into individual ownership, and then profit has been sought, usually by creating a monopoly of one particular kind of agriculture. So the forest does retain these very ancient landscape features, which are almost all gone everywhere else, which makes it a really valuable place for nature to hang on, really.
And you know, I think that's what all of this conversation and the book and the Right to Roam movement are all doing. It's showing us the land in a different context. It's helping us understand that the way it looks and the way it functions and the way it's valued is all a social construct, and we often can't see it because we're in the here and now. But actually, that means that we can change it, and I think that's what I hear from your book. That's what I hear from what Right to Roam are doing. Is that this is, we made this, we can change it, and yeah, there's lots of power and different relationships and all that to work through. But fundamentally, it's in society's gift to decide how we do this. We've got to do that collectively. I mean, I can't wait to. Fascinating to hear what Right to Roam are doing next, Nadia, with the Wild Service. Obviously, you've got the campaign at the moment to extend the Countryside Rights of Way Act as well. I mean, it really feels like a movement whose time has come. What's the next big thing? I mean, I guess it's still Dartmoor, isn't it? Really. You're on mute.
Yes, Dartmoor will keep supporting Dartmoor. We're not going to be appealing that. We're hoping that Dartmoor National Park Authority do, or the local group, the grassroots group down there do that. We won't, but we're going to be putting our energy into campaigning for a Right to Roam Act and working with cross parties to I mean, if Labour do back having a Right to Roam Act, it will be trying to make sure that that is actually a right to roam and not just 8% to 15% or 12%, or making sure it's actually a right to roam, as well as starting to see this idea of wild service to help us culturally go on a journey again to get back to a true connection with nature. And we've got a couple of trespasses coming up. So if you're in Yorkshire, if there's anyone from Yorkshire, we're doing a rivers trespass in July. And we're also going to be doing a trespass. Yeah, look out for that then. Obviously no details yet. And then we also have we're doing a trespass around mental health and access, so working with mental health professionals, see if we can get them trespassing, which would be great. And then we've got loads of local groups over the last 3 or 4 months have popped up all over England, because we want to devolve any kind of work that we do as much as possible and resource it, because that's what power did. It homogenized the population. We don't want a homogenization of a campaign. So how Right to Roam talks in Norfolk and how it talks in Devon is different to us. So get in touch if you're interested in being part of a local group and trespassing.
Wonderful. Well, Nadia, thank you for joining us. Neil, thank you for joining us. Sorry for the cock up on my part for not getting the link over to you. It's been an absolute joy. Nadia, thank you for all the work you're doing. I know you're absolutely exhausted, so I really appreciate. Honestly, I had to persuade Nadia. She was like, I'm like, come and talk to us, please, and she did. So thank you, Nadia. I really appreciate it.
Yes, Nadia, thank you. It was really good to share the screen with you. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. Really nice to meet you, and I can't wait to read your book. And should you ever be over on the Isle of Bute, I know some good lichens.
Excellent.
and Neil, thank you for the book. It is really special. All your books are really special. You've got such a unique perspective, a unique voice, and it's really timely. So thank you for the great work. It's really
thanks for featuring me again. It's very nice to come back, and hopefully the recording will work this time.
Yeah, well, we've nailed the record. It's still recording. It's going. It's good. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. I'm gonna
thank you everyone for coming.
Say bye-bye to everyone.
Yeah, thanks
happy
everyone.
Days.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for joining us, Lewis. Thanks, Andy.
Cheerio.
Thanks, Adam. Your book's on the
Thank
way.
you.
Thanks, Rich. Hello, Sheffield. Thanks for your comments, Casper. Thanks, Yvette. Sorry if it was too confusing at the start. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you.